All right, factoring quadratic expressions, GCFs and trinomials. We learned that one way to solve a quadratic is use a calculator to graph. We have been doing that for a while in class now. We've been finding the zeros. Today we're going to learn a second way to solve a quadratic, which is factoring. Okay, these are just multiple ways you're learning in this chapter to solve a quadratic. And you may be thinking, why? What's the point? If I know one way, who cares about the rest? That's because certain ways to solve a quadratic are quicker than others in certain situations. Okay, so that is why you learn it. So today we're going to learn the second way, which is factoring. Our goal is going to be able to learn how to factor a quadratic today and then solve the equation. Before we discuss factoring out a GCF, which is a greatest common factor, we'll discuss distributing a GCF. Why? Because factoring is the reverse of distributing. So let's look at this first. When we distribute this 4, it gets multiplied times everything. And I want you to remember that. It gets multiplied times everything. So 4 times x squared is 4x squared. And 4 times negative 5x is negative 20x. And 4 times 7, 28. Okay? So notice it gets multiplied by everything. So when we're going to factor, we're going to divide everything out. Divide. And sometimes it gets a little tough when it comes to exponents, and we'll talk about that in a second. So let's discuss factoring out GCF. Let's use this problem. Remember, if distributing is about multiplying, then factoring is about its inverse, which is dividing. Okay, it's about its inverse, which is dividing. So let's look at this problem here. If you're factoring out a greatest common factor, a GCF, you ask yourself, what divides evenly? What's the biggest number, the greatest number that divides it evenly to 4, 20, and 28? And hopefully you will say 4. Now, this has an x and an x. This just has an x and this has no x. So they actually have no x's in common because all 3 of them don't have it. So no x's in common. So just a 4 is going to be factored out. Remember, it's all about dividing. So I'm going to take a side journey here. You do not have to write this down. If we have 4x squared, and we're dividing it by this number right here, when we do this, what we have left over is x squared. Do write the x squared down. If we have negative 20x, and we're dividing it by this 4 right here, we have negative 5x. And if we have positive 28, and we again divide it by this 4 right here, now we have positive 7. So I've drawn this out for you over here, but you don't have to do that. Some of you can do it in your head. I just like to show everybody. And now you have officially factored. So hopefully you see now that factoring out a GCF is just the opposite of distributing. And it gets a little bit more complicated when we have letters, but let's talk about it. Factor out the GCF from the following expression. So the biggest number that divides into 9, 18, and 3, the biggest number is 3. This has a y, this has a y, and this has a y. So real quick, let's discuss what it means to have something in common. If I'm here, okay, and I have a star, and over here, this person, you're not writing this down, I hope, just watch, has a star. And then over here, this person here has 3 stars. How many stars do they have in common? So they have to have it in common. They all have to have it. How many stars do they all have? Not all together, just in common. So 2, 1, and 3, what they all have in common is they all have 1 star. Do you see that? The middle person doesn't have 2 stars, so they don't have 2 stars in common. The first person doesn't have 3 stars, so they don't have 3 stars in common. So when you're looking at this, this is how you want to think about it. So when we go back over to this problem here, y, and y. So what they all have in common is a y. Okay, so now you're going to factor out that GCF. Remember, it's division. Okay, so I'm going to take a side journey here. You don't have to write down what I do on the side, although it could help. So we're taking 9y cubed, and we're dividing it by 3y. So I know you know 9 divided by 3 is 3. But if we look at what's going on top and what's going on the bottom, do you see that a y will also cancel out? So you have 3y squared left over. If we take 18y squared and we divide it by 3y, 18 divided by 3 is 6, and then look what's going on top and on the bottom. And if we cancel those y's out, what we have left is 6y. And watch out on this last one. We have negative 3y and we're dividing by that green 3y. Okay? So notice that this 3y is the green 3y I have over there. Okay? This all cancels, but don't you end up with a negative 1? Right? 3y divided by 3y would be 1. So negative 1. You've now factored out the GCF. Let's look at this next one. The biggest number that goes into 4, 16, and 8. Now if you said 2, that's not the biggest. You want the biggest number, which would be 4. This has an NN, this has an N, and this has no N's. So they don't have any in common then. They have none in common. So you're going to take 4n squared, and you're going to divide it by 4. And hopefully you'll see you get n squared. You take negative 16n, and you divide it by 4. So this would be negative 4n. Ooh, that's an ugly n. Hold up, hold up. Let's fix that up. Then you take 8 and you divide it by 4, and you get 2. So you've now factored out your GCF. And over time you won't have to do this side work, okay? Over time you'll just see it. What happens if there's no GCF? And by the way, if I go too fast, you can go back and rewatch and you can pause me. You are in control of your education. What happens if there's no GCF? Today we're going to discuss what you should do if there's no GCF and if there are 3 terms. When you have these 3 terms, it is called a trinomial. Okay? So there's multiple ways of factoring, guys. Multiple ways. There's guess and check. And then there's also split the middle, which is also called Batman, which is also called the AC method. I mean, in my years, I've seen so many names for this stuff. But the 2 main ones would be split the middle, otherwise known as the AC method or Batman, and or guess and check. And in my class, I tend to do split the middle. Some teachers do guess and check. No one's right. No one's wrong. It doesn't really matter. So I just want to show you my way, which is split the middle. I have all the steps written out on the right-hand side for you. Okay? They're all written out. So factor the following expression completely. So looking at A, you always want to make sure your equation is in descending order, highest exponent to lowest. So 2, 1, none. We're good on step 1. Use these steps. Factor out the GCF if there is one. 1, 9, and 14. There's no number that goes into all those except 1. And they don't all have an x in common, so there's no GCF. No GCF, move to step 3. Label A, B, and C. A is the number that is in front of the x squared. B is the number in front of your x. And C is your number that has no variable with it at all. Make a chart. What multiplies to give you A times C, but adds to give you B. So we've got A times C, B, and this is going to be what multiplies to give you this, and adds to give you this. Well, first, what's A times C? So that'd be 1 times 14, which is 14, and adds to give you B, and B in our case is negative 9. So I always focus on what multiplies to give you 14. Always focus on multiply side. Always focus on the multiply side, okay? I start with 1. 1 times 14 gives me 14. But if I add these together, I get 15, and if I subtract them, I get 13. So I'm never going to get a 9, so that doesn't work. 2 and 7 multiplies to give me 14. They also add to give me 9, but I want them to add to give me negative 9, so they would both have to be negative. So negative 2 times negative 7 is 14, and negative 2 plus negative 7 is negative 9. So we found our match. Play with your numbers till you find the comma. Boom, got it. Split your middle term. Blam! It explodes in 2. Into 2 new numbers that you found in step 4. So this middle term right here turns into these 2 new beautiful numbers, negative 2 and negative 7. So negative 2x minus 7x. So negative 9x becomes negative 2x and negative 7x. We're going to bring down the 14. We're going to bring down the x squared. And then we're going to continue with these steps. On step 6, look at the first 2 terms, factor out the GCF. So looking here, the GCF, the greatest common factor between the 2 is x. X squared, take out an x, is x. Negative 2x, take out an x, is negative 2. Looking here, on step 7, look at the last 2 terms, factor out the GCF. If the third term has a negative, factor that out with your GCF. If there's no GCF, the GCF's 1. So there is a negative here, so I'm going to pull that out. like it says. And the GCF between 7 and 14 is 7. Then we're going to divide. Negative 7x divided by negative 7 is 1x. 14 divided by negative 7 is negative 2. Step 8. Now look at your two huge terms. These are the ones in the parentheses right here. Factor out those two huge terms. It should be the same if you did it right and it's factorable. So notice here this huge term of x minus 2 and x minus 2. We're factoring it out of there. So imagine you're taking your hands, you're ripping it out of there. It's gone. So if this is now factored out and gone, what's left over from left to right is x minus 7. You have now totally factored that problem. Remember when we used to multiply these together and get like this? Now you're going backwards. They're giving you the multiplied out thing, and you're coming up with the factored one. Let's do this next one. So first thing, there's no GCF in all of them. Second thing, A is 6, B is, looky here, negative 1, and C is negative 2. What multiplies to give you A times C, which is 6 times negative 2, so negative 12, but adds to give you B, which is negative 1. 1 and 12 multiply to give you 12, but they add to give you 13 or 11, so they won't work. 2 and 6. 2 and 6 multiply to give you 12, but they add to give you 8 or subtract to give you 4, so they won't work. 3 and 4. These multiply to give you 12, and they can add to give you negative 1, so let's discuss. If we've got to add them to get a negative 1, that means my 4 is going to be negative. Double check. 3 times negative 4 is negative 12, and 3 minus 4 is negative 1. So over here, we've found our two beautiful magical numbers. So instead of negative 1x, we're going to have positive 3x minus 4x. Bring down your other numbers, and then you're going to group. What's the GCF of between 6x squared and 3x? 3x. 6 divided by 3 is 2. X squared, take out an x is x. 3x divided by 3x is 1. GCF between these two right here. Notice there's a negative, so we want to pull that out. And it looks like between 4 and 2, 2 would be the GCF. Negative 4x divided by negative 2 is positive 2x. Negative 2 divided by negative 2 is positive 1. Then look for the enormous GCF. It's right here. 2x plus 1. Imagine you stick your hands in there and you rip that out of there. You factor it out of there. Once it's pulled out of there, 3x minus 2 is left over. Ta-da! You are done. This is a difficult lesson, so I really suggest rewatching it. I just really suggest that because factoring can be very difficult for a lot of people. And don't forget to follow your steps. Until next time, bye!